Hi there, Michael here. Today is the day. Today we're going to take a look at a new immersive audio software release that has the potential to change our entire approach towards Dolby Atmos. Fiedler Audio just released the second version of their mastering console for Dolby Atmos, and while it's technically an update to their existing mastering console, it's in reality a completely new application. The mastering console combines multiple applications into one and offers the first comprehensive mastering solution for Dolby Atmos. No longer do you need to load your existing Dolby Atmos master files into your digital audio workstation if you want to make a couple of adjustments to the final sound. Nor do you need to bother with the Dolby Atmos album assembler if you want to assemble a Dolby Atmos album. You can do everything directly within Fiedler Audio's mastering console. And if that wasn't enough, the mastering console also has a couple of features that no other application supports. Just to give you two examples, the mastering console includes a special limiter that limits pre-render but measures post-render, giving you unprecedented fine-tuning control over your Dolby Atmos. And here's something especially exciting for Windows users. The mastering console allows you to monitor audio in a way that sounds identical to Apple Spatial Audio. So if you are working with Dolby Atmos on Windows and always wondered how your stuff sounds through Apple Spatial Audio, the mastering console can give you that answer. A couple of additional things before we open the software. First, the mastering console is a standalone mastering application, so it integrates seamlessly into any Atmos workflow, whether it's with the internal or external Dolby Atmos renderer in Pro Tools, Fiedler Audio's own Dolby Atmos Composer, or any digital audio workstation that can produce Dolby Atmos natively. Regardless of your approach to Dolby Atmos production, the mastering console can serve as your one-stop solution for all Dolby Atmos mastering needs. Second, while today's video was initially planned as a mastering console walkthrough, it ended up being more of a run-through. The mastering console has so many features, with many of them extending the capabilities of any other software on the market today, that it became impossible to talk about everything in detail within the time frame of a single video. Today's video is therefore more of a bird's eye view, and I'm planning to make additional videos that will dive into certain aspects of the mastering console in more detail in the near future. If that's something you're interested in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get notified whenever I upload a new video. And finally, while I don't consider this a sponsored video, I do need to mention that Fiedler Audio provided me with a free pre-release version of the mastering console. We also had a number of video calls where Thomas Fiedler walked me through his way of thinking and how he approached this update to the mastering console. And it's also no secret that I'm a big fan of Fiedler Audio and their products, as I believe that Fiedler Audio has really stepped in and developed software that significantly extends Dolby's own software offering. But it's very important to note that Fiedler Audio had no influence on what I'm going to say in this video, and they also did not see this video in advance. And with that being said, let's finally have a look at the new release of Fiedler Audio's Dolby Atmos mastering console. Before I open up the mastering console application, a quick note on how I decided to structure this video. If you're a regular viewer, you might have noticed that I usually script most of my videos, but I leave the actual demonstration pretty much unscripted. This is usually not a problem, but the mastering console has so many new features that I would for sure forget to mention something important without any script. So in order to make sure that I'm not leaving anything out, I wrote a cheat sheet. 4 cheat sheets in fact. And we're going to go over everything on here. I will do that in a couple of chapters that I will timestamp in the description so that you can jump back and forth in case you're interested in a particular feature. So let's jump into the first chapter. What was that? Oh yes, initial setup and configuration. So here we have the mastering console. Now the first thing that is always going to happen when you start up the mastering console is that it is going to scan your VST3 plugins. And why that is, we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later. But if that bothers you, you can actually disable that by going here into the settings menu, by clicking on this cogwheel here. And here we have the VST3 plugin setup. And if we click on that, we see all the available plugins, the ones that have been already scanned. And we can also scan them manually. We can select the locations at which we have these VST3 plugins. And here we can also disable the automatic scan at start. So if you disable that, you're not going to be bothered whenever you start up the mastering console, and you can scan your plugins manually. Now, the plugin scanning works actually reasonably well, so Fiedler Audio has that actually pretty well implemented. But as with anything, when it comes to plugin scanning, sometimes there can be a crash. So be aware that there might be certain plugins that the mastering console doesn't really like, and then it can crash a little. But I didn't really have any big issues, not more and not less than I had with any other digital audio workstation. So just be aware of that. So if that bothers you, once again, just disable the plugin scanning at startup and you will be fine. So let's go back into the settings menu, and here we have a couple of additional options that we can set. First of all, we can set up the output. Now, the output in my case is set to the roadcaster. This is so that I can record everything here. In your case, that would be your audio interface, whatever you're using. You can set the sample rate, which should be either 48 kilohertz or 96 kilohertz. Then you can set the buffer size, which should be 512 samples if you're using 48 kilohertz, or 1024 samples if you're using 96 kilohertz. And then we have one feature that a lot of people who have been working within the Fiedler Audio ecosystem have been waiting for a very long time, and that is the ability to tune your room. And for that, all we really need to do is turn tuning on. So we click this button here, this turns tuning on, and then we can select any speaker and we can change the tuning of that particular speaker according to the needs of our acoustic setup. We can save the individual tunings to presets by clicking on this button here and click here on Save As, and then we can also load them back in order to make sure that we have our setup always available to us. Now, I'm not going to really do any tuning simply because I just have a stereo setup and I'm honestly only going to monitor everything through headphones. So this is not going to make a lot of sense for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply set that back to flat and I'm going to disable that. But it's very nice to have that. It's really, really kind of something that was needed, and a lot of people are going to be really happy about that. Core monitoring and spatial audio features. So let's close that again because I don't really need that anymore. Now, the mastering console has dual monitoring paths. On one hand, you can monitor through speakers, through a particular speaker setup. Now, in my case, I have turned it off because I'm only monitoring through headphones, but you can choose anything from stereo up to 9.1.6. And then we have a couple of monitoring modes for headphones. First of all, we can turn them off, obviously. We can monitor in stereo, we can monitor in binaural, and we can also monitor in spatial audio. And this is actually something really unique and something very, very special that a lot of people are going to be really excited about, because what that is monitoring that sounds exactly, and I need to be careful how to actually phrase that sounds exactly like Apple Spatial Audio. And the key to that is that this is also available for Windows users. So if you're a Windows user and you always wondered how your Dolby Atmos sounds when somebody on an iPhone or on a Mac kind of listens to it through Apple Music, you can now monitor that by simply kind of turning that to spatial audio. Fiedler Audio has implemented that in a way that is very unique and very useful, and a lot of people are going to be really excited about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply leave that here with spatial audio. Now, the next thing that we have is equally exciting, at least for me, and that is the possibility to include head tracking. Now, Fiedler Audio has implemented that also in a very unique way. So if I click here on the cogwheel here, I have, because I'm on a Mac, I have two options. I can head track either through Apple. That would include any headphone that has one of the H1 or H2 chips. So the AirPods, for example, the AirPods Max or any of the Beats headphones. Or I can also monitor through the sub-woofer head tracker. Now, what is unique is the way Fiedler Audio implemented the head tracking through the subwoofer head tracker is that they directly communicate to the head tracker. So they are not using any additional software that translates the information that comes out of the head tracker into something that the software understands. Instead, the Fiedler Audio mastering console communicates directly, and that makes things extremely low latency and extremely efficient. I'm probably going to do a separate video just about that because I'm really excited about that. And if you know my videos, you know that I'm really excited about anything that has to do with head tracking. Now, one thing that I need to mention here is that if you are on Windows, even though you can monitor in Apple Spatial Audio, obviously the head tracking with Apple devices does not work. For that, you actually need a Macintosh or any Apple device. Now I'm going to leave that off because I don't have any head tracking device connected to my computer anyway. Now for the next feature, I'm going to load in my first Dolby Atmos master file. And the master file that I'm going to load in here is actually a really simple master file. What I did is I took one of my stereo tracks and just upmixed that to 9.1.6 and converted that into a Dolby Atmos master file. So don't expect any sophisticated Dolby Atmos. This is really just a very simple Dolby Atmos master file. And what I wanted to point out with that master file is the visualization, or the type of visualization that you get. First of all, the master file itself is visualized through a 5.1 downmix, and that is exactly the same way it is visualized, for example, in the Dolby Atmos album assembler. So this is just a visualization. Does not mean that the master file is just used as a 5.1. In the background, everything works with the full master file, with the full Dolby Atmos, but in the visualization you see a 5.1 as something that just gives you some idea of what the Dolby Atmos is about. And then we have the actual visualization, the 3D visualization here down in the lower right corner, and we can actually make that larger by either clicking here on this enlarge button, or we can also go into this view here. It's actually the same thing. And that will then give us a good representation where all the objects are. Now, in my particular case, I have once again just a stereo file upmixed to 9.1.6. So these are pretty much the speaker locations of a 9.1.6 system. And that's really everything that I have for this particular file. Workflows, timeline, and basic editing. So let's go back into the timeline view. Now, in addition to the Dolby Atmos master file, you can also load in stereo files. So in this particular case, I actually have a stereo mastered version for that particular Dolby Atmos file. And let me just drop that in. The Dolby Atmos mastering console will automatically recognize if that is a stereo file or a Dolby Atmos file. And you see the stereo file here at the bottom and the Dolby Atmos file here on top. And I can actually monitor both. So I can listen to either the Dolby Atmos file or I can listen to the stereo file. So let me just kind of take my headphones and let's just play that a little. So the standard is that you hear the Dolby Atmos master file, and if you want to hear the stereo version, you would click here on this stereo button, and that will essentially switch over to the stereo version. So if I click that now, I've switched over to the stereo version. Now, because of the way I constructed my Dolby Atmos as an upmix of the stereo, you're actually not going to hear any difference. It's essentially the same thing, but this will actually allow you to switch back and forth between monitoring the stereo and monitoring the Dolby Atmos. So this once again is stereo. If I click that, it is back to Dolby Atmos. Now each clip has 4 handles, and these 4 handles serve 2 functions. The handles on top of the clip are used for fades, so I can simply grab those handles and I can fade them in. I can do that at the end and I can do that at the beginning, obviously. If I right-click on that handle, I have 2 different options for how that fade is going to be applied. And the handles at the bottom of that clip can be used in order to shorten that clip. Or essentially kind of to extend it in case you've already shortened that. And that works for both the ADM file as well as the stereo file. So also at the stereo file here, I can simply grab that handle and I can apply the fade. And that actually gives us a couple of really interesting options. In particular, we will be able to create crossfades. So let's drop in a second ADM file because we want to create a crossfade. And it's called something simple here. So I'm going to drop that in. Same thing, stereo file upmixed to 9.1.6. I'm also going to drop in the corresponding stereo master. And here we have it. Now with having these two Dolby Atmos master files in the mastering console, I now have two different workflows on how I can work with those. I can either work in batch mode, which is the standard, which treats these clips as independent clips. So I would work with them independently, and it's sort of a collection of clips. Or I can switch over to what's called the album mode. And this is simply done by clicking on this button here. This will turn everything into an album mode. And now I have a couple of additional options that allow me, for example, to do crossfades between individual clips. And for doing a crossfade, all I really need to do is I need to take that clip and I need to drag it. And I can then essentially overlay that. And I now have a crossfade between two Dolby Atmos master files. Now, obviously, the way I have done it now is I've only overlaid the Dolby Atmos master files, and I actually would like to do the same thing with the stereo files. Now, I could do that manually and kind of change that as well, but there's actually a better way to do that, so let me just kind of put that back here. I actually have a snap functionality here that allows me to kind of smooth that so that it actually snaps back to where it was. So here, snap. And let me just kind of turn the, oopsie, I didn't want to do that. So let me just turn the handle here back, this handle here back to where it was. And what I can do now is I can select the ripple edit mode. And what the ripple edit mode is, it allows me to move a couple of clips simultaneously by grabbing just one clip. And if you have ever worked with a video editing software, you know exactly how that works, because that is a very, very common way to work in video editing. But ripple mode essentially means that if I click on this ripple mode, I can then essentially simply take a clip, and that would essentially move everything that is behind that clip along with that particular clip. I can do that for the Dolby Atmos master files. I can do that if I click once again. I can do the same thing for the stereo files. And I can also do that for both simultaneously. And if I select that ripple mode, if I now grab that clip, I can move both the stereo and the ADM simultaneously. So I can now overlay that, and I can create crossfades. So I can just do that here. And maybe also the same thing for the stereo. And then let's just play the audio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the playhead to the beginning here of this crossfade. And then let's just play our audio and see how, or hear how that transition sounds. Now the second one comes in. And obviously the same thing is also true for the stereo files. So if I'm going back a little, I have the same thing in the stereo files as well. Now before we continue, we need to talk about one concept that is super important in the mastering console, and that is the concept of regions. Now I have to admit that I did not fully understand it immediately, but that is almost embarrassing, because once you really understood what it is, it's super simple. And the basic idea is that we have two clips here. One clip here, this was the first one, and this was the second one, and they are cross-faded, so they are overlapping. If we now export that as two individual ADMs, as two individual Dolby Atmos master files, these resulting master files obviously have to have a different length because they are overlapping, otherwise it would not work. So we need to define certain regions that define how long these master files are once we have them exported, and this is done by these region markers. So in other words, if I click on this region here, this would be the first ADM file in case I export that. That essentially means that it would include the entire first clip and then the entire crossfade. And the second region would go from the beginning of the end of the crossfade to a little bit beyond the original clip, and that is because we moved that clip a little. Now we can move those region markers around, and we can also automatically adjust them. So in this particular case, I'd like to really kind of make sure that they are optimally distributed. So what I can do is I can simply right click, and here I have two options. I can either say auto split, and that would split them automatically in the best possible way. Or I can also simply combine everything into one region, and that would mean that I would not create two ADMs in the export, I would just create one ADM, and that's fine as well. So you could create a gapless album and then just export everything as one ADM, or you can kind of split that up into individual regions. So let's just auto-split that here, and that creates the regions in the optimal way. And this is important to understand because some of the features of the mastering console work on regions and some of the features work on clips. The one thing that I should mention is that we can also input those numbers manually. So if we want to, for example, give a very specific starting point, we can do that. We have here the start time, the end time, the length of that particular region. And if we do the same thing for the clip, we also have the fade in and the fade out. And what we can do is we can simply double click here and then essentially manually edit that. And we can do that in different units. So if we want to do that in samples, for example, we can do that as well. But normally, obviously, we would do that with kind of regular time code. And then one final thing before we move on, if you are working with the mastering console, you might wonder how to actually zoom in and zoom out. And the way Fiedler Audio has implemented that is a little bit different to the traditional way of how this is implemented. And Fiedler Audio implemented that here with a button. So what you need to do is you need to kind of click on that button, and then essentially you can zoom in and zoom out. And you can do the same thing kind of vertically in order to increase or decrease the size of your waveforms. And that is a little bit unusual, but actually once you get used to it, it's very convenient because you can never really mess up the zooming that you have here. That's something that happens to me quite often if I'm working with a system that allows me to just kind of use my mouse in order to zoom around, that I usually end up with something that I didn't really zoom into. And so in this particular case, I think this is actually really convenient to have it like that. And then one final thing that I did not mention yet, obviously we also have the ability to monitor each individual channel. So if we have a speaker setting, for example, let's set it to 9.1.6 and I play the audio, I see, well, currently I'm playing the stereo file, but if I'm playing the ADM, I see the action on each individual speaker. Master channel, processing, and editor section. So for the next demonstration, let me add an additional ADM, and I'm also going to add the corresponding stereo file here. And now we have three clips and three regions. Actually, currently we only have two regions. So let me just kind of auto-split it again so to create this additional region. So we now have three regions here, one region, two regions. This is the third region. And at the same time, we have the three clips. And what I want to do now is I want to look at the mastering section, because that is actually something that is really unique to the mastering console. Because what we can do now is we can apply plugins both to the ADM, to the Dolby Atmos master file, but also to the stereo file. So if we click on one of the clips, so let's just click on the first one here, then we see this additional master channel pop up. And this is where we can load in all the plugins that are applied to that particular clip. Now this master channel acts on the clip, which is obvious because if you have a crossfade, for example, you don't want to have anything kind of changing in the middle of the crossfade. It needs to be for the entire clip. So it doesn't work on the region. This works actually on the clip. And what we can do here is, well, first of all, we can change the gain, but that's something that I'm not going to do here. We can load in additional plugins. And this is actually really unique because what we can do here is we can load special plugins that operate not on the final audio, but operate actually on the Dolby Atmos master file. And these plugins are in Fiedler Audio's OBAM format. I actually did a video about that format not that long ago. And that's really unique because what it allows you to do, or what it theoretically allows you to do, is it allows you not only to create plugins that can change the audio that sits on an object, but also the position of the object, for example. So it has access to all the information, to all the metadata in the Dolby Atmos master file, and it can manipulate all the metadata that you have in the Dolby Atmos master file. Now, at the moment, there are only two OBAM plugins available. The first one is Tone Boosters Equalizer Pro. I actually did a video about that. And the second one is Fiedler Audio's Gravitas MDS. That is a compressor. Also did a video about that. I'm going to leave links in the description below. Now, so let's load one in. Now, once again, these are plugins that now operate on the individual object. So if I'm now opening the Tone Boosters Equalizer Pro, and I add a filter here, I can then select which of the objects this filter is acting on. So if I'm clicking here on the All button, I now have the selection, and by standard it's kind of acting on everything. But I can now say I want this filter only to work on left and right channel, or only on the LFE, or only on the object number 3, or only on object number 6 and number 1. I can do all of that, and that's actually really convenient. And I can do the same thing, obviously, also with the other plugin. And once again, this is super interesting. This is a new plugin standard, apparently not that difficult to implement. So if you're a plugin developer out there who seeks an opportunity to differentiate themselves, this would actually be a good opportunity, because there are not a lot of plugins out there currently that can utilize the OBAM infrastructure, and there are so many possibilities out there that nobody has ever thought about in terms of what you can do with the metadata in a Dolby Atmos master file through a plugin, and Fiedler Audio's mastering console gives you direct access to that. So this is actually super interesting. So if there's anybody out there interested in developing these types of plugins, I recommend that you get in touch with Fiedler Audio. They're more than happy to give you all the information that you need. And kind of looking at how quickly Tone Boosters implemented that for the Equalizer Pro, it seems that it is not particularly complicated to implement that. So let me delete that Tone Boosters equalizer again, because I don't really need that here. And obviously what you can also do is you can select the stereo clip here, and then you can add plugins to that stereo clip as well. And that obviously is going to be your selection of VST3 plugins that you can apply. And this is also the main reason why it scans all VST3 plugins at the beginning, because it wants to have access to those. And you can use all your plugins in order to do the fine-tuning and to do real mastering, both on the stereo track, but also on the Dolby Atmos track. So these are all cool features, but we are not even close to being done yet. So the next thing we're going to look at is the editor section here, and that is its own view. So if we click here on the editor, and what this editor section allows you to do is it allows you to change certain layouts in your Dolby Atmos master file. Now in my particular case, all these files are pretty much the same, because once again I just upscaled a stereo track to a 9.1.6, so they look all exactly the same. But you might run into situations where you have different Dolby Atmos master files that have completely different object layouts, and you need to somehow figure out a way on how to line them up so that you can kind of satisfy certain requirements. You might want to create a gapless album, and that has certain requirements associated with it. So you need to figure out how to do that, and that's essentially what you can do here. Now, let's do the simple things first. Well, obviously, we can, if we look at the individual tracks, and we now have essentially these 3 clips here. I've selected the first clip. We can obviously mute individual channels. We can solo individual channels. We can change the binaural mode. We can change the description. We can assign groups if you have them. And then we have the transitions, and these are the transitions that you have. Right now I have only one. This is the transition going from the first clip to the second clip, so this crossfade that I had. And what I can do now is I can move these objects around. So if in my particular case, I don't have to do that, because the objects are exactly where they're supposed to be. So they're lining up completely because they are created in the same way, or they have been created in exactly the same way. But let's, for example, say we have one object in the next track at a completely different place. So for them, we can move that, for example, to place number 19. And that would essentially now mean that these 2 clips or these 2 ADMs don't really match. They don't really kind of align correctly. And we can actually see that here on top by this gapless indicator. That essentially is the indicator that tells us if the Dolby Atmos construction that we have, let's call this construction, the Dolby Atmos session that we have, is actually compliant with a gapless playback. And in this particular case, it isn't, because our object that we have, we now moved that essentially to channel number 19. So what we can do if we arrive at such a situation is we can simply select that and can move that around so that we line them up. Now in my particular case, obviously what I have to do is I have to move that back to channel number 11. And as soon as I have to move to channel number 11, it shows that the gapless now is okay. So I'm now compliant and I can create a gapless album. So this allows you to move objects around and to make sure that they line up correctly. And then the final thing that we have here is for each individual region, we have individual settings for the ADM that we're going to export. So we can change the surround trim, the height trim, and different settings that we need. For example, also the time code start, so that the resulting ADMs are all encoded correctly. loudness management and true peak limiting. So one thing that we have not yet looked at is the true peak limiter, and you might have seen that in the timeline view. So let's go back to the timeline view, and here at the bottom we have this true peak limiter, and this is actually a very, very special limiter that a lot of people are going to be really, really excited about. What does this limiter do? Essentially it limits pre-render but measures post-render, and that essentially means that you can really fine-tune your loudness management. You can make sure that you hit the minus 18 LKFS as exactly as possible because you're measuring post-render and then applying the limiter pre-render. So you're not kind of screwing up through the rendering process. The rendering process has no influence. You're actually really hitting the target exactly. So if you're really interested in managing your loudness as exactly as possible, this is a godsend. There's essentially nothing else that can achieve that. Now, for that to work, what we need to do is we first need to measure the loudness of our individual regions. So let's click on the measure button here. This opens up the individual ADMs, and we can now measure them all. And that is going to measure them. Now, in my particular case, I'm clearly below the minus 18 LKFS. So this is about 3 kind of dBs below that. And I can then use that information in order to set the true peak limiter in order to make sure that what I'm hitting is exactly minus 18 LKFS. And this is obviously something that you can do either by auto-adjusting the individual clips. So this is something that you can do, or you can also adjust it manually, for example, by changing that slider here. And then obviously you would also have to enable the true peak limiter. And this is really cool because I'm not aware of any other limiter that does that. And this is something that really allows you to fine-tune your loudness management, to really be as accurate as possible. And from what I'm hearing is that this is something that a lot of professionals really desperately need. So I think a lot of people are going to be really excited about that. And then we have one additional limiter. So believe it or not, the mastering console actually has 2 limiters. And the second limiter is something that I was not aware of, that this would actually be useful. And probably a lot of people out there are not aware that this is actually useful. It turns out that if you're creating a Dolby Atmos to the specifications and you've created everything according to what is required and you have reached the minus 18 LKFS, and then you listen to it on some external device and it suddenly doesn't sound the way it was supposed to sound. It suddenly sounds a little bit crappy. And the reason for that is that sometimes there is an additional limiter applied to the playback of your Dolby Atmos master file, and for whatever reason that limiter is not part of the Dolby Atmos renderer. So what you're hearing out of the Dolby Atmos renderer is not necessarily what you're hearing when you're playing that back through a streaming service or on any other device. And that is because there is sometimes an additional limiter on there, and Fiedler Audio has actually implemented that limiter, and this is something that you can enable and disable with this button here, additional render headroom. So if this button is enabled, then the mastering console acts exactly like the Dolby Atmos renderer with no additional limiting on there. And if I disable that button, then this additional limiter is set, and I hear the Dolby Atmos in exactly the same way I would hear it through a streaming service, for example. Export options. Now this leaves us with one final thing to talk about, and that is the export. And the export is super simple. All we have to do is we need to go into the session menu here, and here we find an export button. So let's click on the export button. And there are different things that we can export. So we can export the individual ADMs, and once again, those are the regions that are exported. We can export that in 9.1.6 or 9.1.4 or 7.1.4 and so forth and so forth. And we can also export that in binaural. We can also export that in spatial audio. So once again, this is the same, or it sounds the same as Apple Spatial Audio. I need to be very careful how to actually say that because it is not technically not Apple Spatial Audio. It just sounds exactly the same. So you can export that and send it to somebody who doesn't have an Apple device, for example. And then you can also export the stereo track as well. And the way to do that is super simple. We just press next, and then we have to select the location where we want to export our Dolby Atmos master files. In my particular case, I'm just going to send it to the downloads folder, and we open it up, and that's now going to export everything. Once again, 3 regions. And first one is succeeded, second one, and then this third one, And that essentially then concludes everything. And once I've done, I can upload everything to a streaming service, distributor, whatever I want to do with that. And I'm pretty much done. So what's my final verdict? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that I'm very excited about this release. Fiedler Audio's mastering console for Dolby Atmos addresses a long-standing need in the Atmos community. It's the type of software that Dolby should have developed years ago, but for some reason never did. And it is refreshing that a small developer like Fiedler Audio was able to step in and deliver an application that the big Dolby couldn't. I also commend Fiedler Audio for making sure that everything is properly certified by Dolby. In reality, the software was ready for release before the summer, but it took Dolby a couple of weeks to check everything. So all the features of the mastering console have been checked and rechecked by Dolby and are guaranteed to be compliant with Dolby's technology. In terms of intended users, the mastering console is more targeted towards the professional user. That includes anybody serious about Dolby Atmos production. The price tag shows that a bit. At the same time, it's not so expensive that it would become inaccessible to hobbyists. I think Fiedler Audio hit a really nice balance there. One minor thing to consider is that this is an initial release version of an application that does include an enormous amount of new features, so you might run into an interface glitch or bug here and there. But Fiedler Audio has been incredibly diligent in fixing everything they came across immediately. Over the last couple of weeks, for example, I received updates almost every single day. So I'm fairly certain that any remaining glitches will sort itself out very quickly. So yeah, I'm super excited that the mastering console is now publicly released, and I'm looking forward to making a couple more videos going over some details. If there's anything you want me to talk about first, let me know in the comments and I'll try to squeeze that into my release schedule. Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.